But when you look at the fastest growing companies and how they've actually grown and why they grow as fast as they can, what you see is a totally different dynamic. Rather than taking a shape of sort of this linear funnel that has a very defined start and end point, it actually takes the form of a loop. Whatever this loop does, it generates, it can be reinvested back into the first step of the loop. And what that does is it creates more of like a compound interest effect. And that's part of what's fueling this growth over such a long period of time.
There is no exact playbook for growth.
People want to keep this secret.
For the most part, companies are successful because they've managed to excel at one or two channels.
I think a lot of times your growth is dictated by the market.
Word of mouth, though important, does not work when you don't have any customers.
I'm Dave. Get ready to scale or die. What's up, Growth Nation? Welcome back to Scale or Die, the show where we uncover proven growth strategies from CEOs and growth experts behind some of the world's fastest growing startups. I'm your host, Dave Rogamoser, and today I invited a new friend, Brian Balfour, on the show. He was the VP of Growth at HubSpot for about 2 years, and then over the last 2.5 years has been running a new startup, which he calls Reforge, which basically helps other startups install and implement growth strategies into their company. And Brian's been a guy, I've studied SaaS more, studied growth, studied marketing. How do you actually scale these companies? Brian comes up over and over and over as a guy to go to. So Brian, thanks so much for joining us on here today. I'm excited to kind of dig in.
Thanks for having me.
So I guess kind of first question, how would you describe what you are doing at Reforge and what you're helping companies with right now?
Yeah, Reforge is a professional education startup. So, what we focus on is one of the things that I think a lot of people talk about in our industry today is like so many things are changing so quickly. Whether we're talking about like the macro environment or you just look at like a product manager or a marketing manager's role, they'll be on new projects pretty often. And as a result, we're constantly solving like new problems and need to get up to speed extremely quickly. But for a lot of this stuff, a lot of the knowledge is still, trapped in the heads of a very small group of leading like frontier practitioners. So what we do is we basically untrap that knowledge and package it in a way for a mid-career professional who can like get up to speed extremely quickly on the world's like best practices and strategies. They gain like a whole set of frameworks and tools to problem solve a lot of the initiatives that they're working on internally. And as a result, they basically can create impact much more quickly, which impacts the company and the career as well. So tangibly, what this looks like right now is basically a series of 8-week programs, hybrid online and live in person. You apply, we select, we match you with a bunch of really high quality peers and access to a network kind of along the way. And basically just try to deliver that impact in as short of a period of time as possible.
Very cool, man. And you've been doing it about 2.5 years. That's right.
Yeah, that's correct. It actually kind of evolved out of my time at HubSpot. Basically, I would sit in these one-on-ones every single week with my team, and they would be asking me about what to do in terms of professional development and advancement. And every time somebody would ask me, I would spend hours trying to research, recommendations of what to send them. But I just found pretty much everything out there was like too surface level, entry level, or wasn't applicable to the industry, or kind of what we were doing internally at HubSpot. And so I decided I was going to create something kind of on the side, and joined up with Andrew Chen, who was formerly at Uber and now at Andreessen Horowitz. And we kind of just like did this thing on the side, and it just did way better than I expected. And I realized, hey, like this isn't a little problem that some of my team is having at HubSpot. This is actually something that almost everybody who's kind of in the middle of their career are thinking about. And so I decided that to take the leap and focus on it a little bit more full time. And I'm kind of, here we are a couple of years later.
Very cool, man. One thing I wanted to ask you about is funnels versus loops. And I feel like loops are what I'm reading about more and I'm seeing, is driving growth, for us more and more. I've heard you talk about it. I think HubSpot at their recent conference said, funnels are dead. That's really the loop of the flywheel that's here to stay. I guess, what are your thoughts on that, and how should startups think about those?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be clear, I think our concept and definition of a loop at Reforge and among kind of our community is kind of different than HubSpot's. HubSpot kind of came to a semi-similar but different conclusion. Post my time at HubSpot, we actually never talked about loops while I was there internally, and so we kind of, Andrew Chen, Casey Winters, and Sean Klaus and I kind of sort of sat down to really define this framework. And we have a blog post around this on Reforge if you'd like to read more about it. But the extent of it is that that we often look, historically we've looked at growth through a funnel, most popularized by Dave McClure, the pyrometrics, the R, like acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue. And so, but when you look at the fastest growing companies and how they've actually grown and why they grow as fast as they can, what you see is a totally different dynamic. And rather than growth taking the shape, the thing that is powering growth, rather than taking a shape of sort of this linear funnel that has a very defined start and end point, it actually takes the form of a loop, in the sense that it, whatever this loop does, it generates, it can be reinvested back into the first step of the loop. And what that does is it creates more of like a compound interest effect. And that's part of what's fueling this growth over such a long period of time. And so there's three different things that can be like invested back, that a loop can generate and be invested back into a loop. The first is, of course, users. A loop can produce users, and those can be reinvested back into the loop to generate more users. Those are broadly defined as viral loops. A loop can produce content or some other type of digital asset that can be reinvested in the loop. You see this in play in companies like Pinterest, or in the B2B audience, like G2 Crowd would be a great example. Or the loop generates money that can be reinvested, and this is more of like paid and sales loops. And so when you actually take a look at and start to frame your business around loops, it starts to change a few different things. One is that when you form a loop, it actually includes both it's both a mixture of your kind of marketing channels, product, and your monetization model holistically in one, rather than it sort of being separate pieces. You also sort of start to see and identify like different lever points. The math changes when you reinvest it. And so whereas you might think the big friction point is one thing, looking at it through a funnel, when you start to look at it through a loop framework, you might find totally different things. And then, of course, third, in order to properly execute on these loops, you actually need to build different types of teams, cross-functional teams, and as well as sort of different types of quantitative models to actually sort of evaluate and prioritize different product initiatives. So that's kind of like the general concept and where it stemmed from. And this came from just looking at like over 100 companies and talking to just tons of leading practitioners about like their views and their approach to things over time.
Yeah, I recently just bought the like 23andMe DNA kit, on Black Friday, and signed up for that so I can, get my DNA, analyzed, get my health and ancestry. And I just got it back, I think 2 days ago. So it was about a 3-week turnaround time. And I'm sitting there at lunch with the team, and I'm like reading off all my stats and telling everyone, all these cool things that, this thing told me. And like right there, somebody else signed up for it, because I got my stats back, was reading it. And I was thought like, if I'm 23andMe, like I'm thinking, how can I put all my money into like shortening that cycle where I can get that back a day later instead of 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later, because that's where like this loop starts to close, and like I start telling everybody else about it, but I can't do anything until I get my results back. So like, is that like an example of like what you're seeing in startups?
Yeah, some of it, exactly. Like when you look at a product like that and start to try to reconnect the dots to form a loop, once again, as you just mentioned, you start to think about a different set of things, right? You might switch your mental model from just like, how do I spend more money efficiently in paid acquisition, right, to acquire more customers, to, well, actually, like, let me think about this connection more, how to make that connection stronger, how to accelerate it, right? And so that's just, once again, it kind of changes the frame of thinking and the math around it. And part of the tough thing about loops is that you have to loop at them over a period of time, right? Like going back to that financial analogy, right? Compound interest only looks incredibly compelling when you play it out over time versus, if you look at more like linear methods through funnels, what you're that's like, those are kind of like instantaneous deposits, right? And yeah, like instantaneous deposit in the short term might look a little bit better, but those instantaneous deposits run out, right? And so the question is how do you kind of put that money, or in software terms, those users or other assets, to work for you to like keep generating more of the same thing over time.
So I guess, like, how far out should companies be looking before they can really start to get the picture of like, here's how loops play out, here's how growth cycles will play out in your company?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on where the company is at in sort of the broad stage of things, right? There's certainly at the very, very beginning of the company, it's still about a question of like product market fit. But I would argue that too many companies become too siloed on product market fit and actually never think through what we would call a growth model, which is basically a systematic explanation of like, assuming that we do hit product market fit, like how does this thing grow? Like what are the loops in the system that we think we're going to deploy? But even then, even if you like, once you have that hypothesis, you need to think about a loop almost as every loop requires a certain amount of fuel to like kickstart it and get it going, right? And so where does that fuel come from? Well, that fuel is what I would categorize as sort of a set of linear tactics, like the do things that don't scale, the really scrappy, the manual stuff, accessing very small ceiling but highly targeted channels, right? Like things like that. And so the whole point is that you invest those things to kind of get the loops kind of spinning, and then as that happens, the amount of return that you're getting from the loops overtakes what you're getting from the linear channels. And then all of a sudden the math starts to become, well, actually, it's much more compelling for us to spend our limited time and resources just optimizing the steps of the loop rather than fueling it with kind of like this tinder, this like initial fuel. And so the challenge is like most startups I see in that state never think about the medium to long-term loops, right? And so they never ease off of those initial linear taxes, and those things run out and growth sort of like hits a ceiling, right? Or vice versa. As I see much more rarely is that they're thinking almost like too long-term, right? And they never get that initial fuel. And so this is part of the art of like figuring out how to balance and manage and shift sort of this time and effort and resources over time. And then, of course, much later in the stage of the company is like, then it becomes an exercise of like, well, actually, how do I start to sequence and layer on brand new types of loops in the business that enable whole new like S curves of growth, and these things sort of later in the stage of the business start to look at what we would call internally at Reforge macro loops, right? Those are things that we commonly refer to as different forms of network effects, embedding, scale, things of that nature, which also take the form of a loop, but you typically can't enable till like a much later state. And so that's why you see companies like HubSpot or Slack or anything start to enable platforms, different types of software platforms and integrations and all that kind of stuff into their business. So there is a bit of a order of operations to these things, and layering on these things over time is just, once again, the exercise is a little bit different depending on where you're at in the company.
Okay. And where do you think like paid traffic plays into startups? Like, how should they be thinking about it? Is that just like the kindling at first, get that thing out there to get the loop started and get the flywheel moving, and then maybe back off for a while? Or I don't know, how do you think about it?
I mean, essentially, paid marketing should always be looked at as it's okay. Like, I think, it's funny, like if you would have asked us, I think 3 years ago, we would have been having this conversation where like everybody was touting, they spent like zero money on like paid marketing, and that was a phenomenal thing. And I looked at that as like, well, actually, like you're just kind of under optimizing, right? And so I guess the risk is, the challenge is when paid marketing, or like basically a paid loop where you basically spend money, you convert a percentage to acquire customers, a certain percentage of those become paying customers who generate money, which you can reinvest back into acquiring more customers. That when that thing is the core, the centerpiece of your entire growth model, that's a big red flag to me, because paid loops always the economics always decrease over time. And what we see most across a lot of the companies we interact with is that they actually don't anticipate or underestimate how those economics change over time. And that's because typically in paid marketing, you start with the audience that produces the best economics, your most targeted audience, and then you move out in concentric circles, wider and wider audiences. But as you do that, all of the steps of the loop, all of those conversion variables and the steps in the loop start to decrease over time. So you're basically reducing the output. And as you reduce the output, you're not able to reinvest it as much, right? As much money. And so anyways, this thing compounds in the reverse direction. Where paid marketing is a phenomenal thing is where you have some other type of loop at the core of the model, and you're layering on paid marketing as like an accelerant to that thing. And so whether that's more of like a content oriented loop or a viral loop or something else. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why we're seeing sort of the rise of bottoms up or product led sort of SaaS driven growth models. But this is partially one of it. And there's a broader thing with paid marketing right now, which is that it's concentrated across a few very different companies. There's companies, Facebook and Google and all kinds of stuff. The inventory is becoming saturated. And it's unclear we're not at the peak, but it feels like we're pretty close right now. So we'll see how that all plays out.
Yeah, we were looking at some of our Facebook, spending before Proof. We were a marketing agency, and we did a ton of stuff with paid traffic. So that was kind of our bread and butter going into this, and helped us launch Proof quickly. But it's funny, we were looking at like our metrics last week compared to like even like 3 years ago, and it was like the cost of a click now is what we used to be able to get a new trial for back in the day, or an actual lead or anything like that. And it's just like the economics have changed so dramatically that it just doesn't work the same way.
Yeah, I mean, internally at HubSpot, like when I started there, like paid marketing internally was just like the devil basically, but we were working on these new products that actually had some viral loops sort of at the centerpiece of it. And so I used paid marketing as a way to sort of jumpstart and accelerate those things. And it was extremely successful. I remember we were acquiring users for like 40 cents, 50 cents a pop, from Facebook ads, the glory days, right? But even in the limited time, like the 2 years, right, we saw those economics massively decrease for both internal reasons of us kind of expanding, right, once again, that target audience in concentric circles, but then the macro environment of like these things becoming more saturated over time. Paid marketing is more of an accepted. I actually think HubSpot just released like something about how they view sort of paid marketing as part of the inbound marketing strategy and the philosophy that they sort of preach. Once again, it's like whenever you see something, it's like all or nothing, or it feels like a binary argument. Most often that argument is completely wrong. And the real answer is like some form of a balance or understanding when to use what.
Yeah, totally. And I think when I look at like growth, talk about loops and all this, like it tends to trend towards like consumer facing products. It's easy to talk about like Lime scooters and Bird and, oh, here's how they're doing it. Or even maybe like in B2B, like more of the like team, like a Slack. But I guess like outside of that, like what are some other examples of companies that are, B2B that are doing this well, like a Salesforce or a HubSpot or a Gusto or an Intercom? How can they build these kinds of things, into their products?
Well, I think all of the ones you just mentioned all have pretty strong loops at the core of their model. Others I would add on to there would be like companies like InVision, which I think, today at the time of this recording just raised a massive amount of funding. Zapier would be another one that I would put up there that's generated, some pretty compelling both content and integration loops. G2 Crowd would be another one that has utilized content loops within the B2B setting. We deal like about 50% of Reforge students are B2B, about 50% are B2C, and we always get this question from the B2B folks. And I think the default thinking right now is that B2B is fundamentally different than B2C, and that is, in my opinion, that is completely wrong. All of these same frameworks and principles apply. The difference is just that typically the cycle time on all of these different loops in the B2B world are slower. And so in practice, it can feel kind of different, but in reality, it's not. Now, the trade-off of that is that typically in the B2B models, while these cycles are slower, the monetization models tend to generate much higher like ARPU per customers. And so that's sort of the trade-off. But at the end of the day, in the B2B, you're still targeting an individual or a set of individuals or a progression of individuals. And so all of these, I think a lot of times B2B marketers, and I'm including myself in that, just overcomplicate this set of thinking. And so, and if we did like a historical timeline, you just see like all of like B2B marketing initiatives start to just look closer and closer to consumer stuff from, a few years prior. So, and once again, this is not because B2B is different than B2C. It's just that the cycles are slower. And so it takes longer for these things to play out.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, last question before we wrap up here is, you're doing this for yourself now. You're not just teaching others how to do it. You've got your own company, your own startup that you're trying to apply these things to. I guess, how are you doing that at Reforge? And what are some of the challenges been of doing this just for your own company?
Well, I think the challenges with Reforge is that, it's by nature, the way that we've constructed right now is a seasonal business. We run right now 2 cohorts per year, one in kind of the spring and one in the fall. And whenever you deal with seasonality in a business, it adds just an extra layer of complexity. The feedback cycles on all of this stuff just end up being much, much longer. And so you have to approach the problems, a little bit different.
Why do you do it seasonal?
Why do we do it seasonal?
Yeah, why'd you decide on that, if that creates some of those extra challenges?
Because a piece of the program is a live interaction component. So live with, peers, as well as live with, we bring in like all the VPs from Dropbox, Facebook, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. And so to basically have that piece of component in the model, we have to do sort of a live sequence cohort where everybody's kind of going through the material at the same time. So that's the main reason why. But we do deploy a lot of these things in our application process. We actually have some viral loops built into our application process through pulling in your colleagues, as well as like these vouch mechanisms, which pull in managers, which then fuel the managers, bringing in more colleagues. So we deployed it that way. And there's a number of like content loops built in our model through just like, traditional content marketing. So we do kind of, we do deploy a lot of this, but Reforge as an overall state, right, I would say is sort of in that middle of, I would say in terms of where the pendulum is between like linear tactics to kickstart all of these loops versus deploying it all towards loops. We are still like a little bit more in the linear tactics, working our way over to, the other shift. So that's just kind of where we're at. That's just kind of where we're at as a business, and working our way to the long-term big.
Yeah, very cool. Looks like a sweet program. So I'm excited to see where that goes. All right, man. So just wrapping up here, I've got what I call the salty 6. It's just 6 like rapid fire questions for us to just get to know you a little bit better, answer them, relatively briefly, and we'll kind of fly through them here. So you ready?
Let's do it.
This is my favorite part of it. It's like a little shotgun. Okay, cool. Number 1, what do you do for fun?
Well, lately I've been watching University of Michigan basketball, which has been a pleasant surprise this season, especially after we just got destroyed in football by Ohio State. So that's where I went to school and that's where I grew up, and so it's giving me some joy right now. Okay, very cool. Do you have a morning routine, and if so, what is it? Yep, I do. So I wake up. I don't set an alarm, but it's typically like 7-ish a.m. And then I immediately go for about a 2.5 mile run. I come back and get coffee. Sorry, I missed the most important thing there. Coffee. I was an advisor for Blue Bottle Coffee for a while and learned a lot about coffee. And so now I'm unfortunately a coffee snob. But anyways, I get the coffee. I do typically a couple hours of my most intensive work, a lot of writing, a lot of thinking. I then take a shower, and then we have our team is mostly remote right now. We have our team sync at noon, and that takes me to about noon. So that's
gotcha. Very cool. Love it. This kind of rolls into that last one. Then, how do you focus during the day and like structure to make sure you're getting the right things done?
I mean, I'll be honest and say there's probably so many more things I could do to be more focused. One thing that I'm very protective of is I almost like very rarely have meetings in the morning. And that's because it's my most productive time. And I try to do my most energy consuming activities, thinking activities in the morning, and then save all sorts of meetings and other kind of just like logistical operation stuff for the afternoon. A couple recommendations here. If you've never read the book Powerful Engagement, I sort of recommend. I read it like 8 or 9 years ago, and sort of that's kind of where I established this routine from. But the things that I fail at are I've had a really hard time establishing a meditation routine, even though like I know it's very beneficial and I feel better after it. I was starting to see myself get sucked into social media, but I just deleted all social media from my phone and stuff about 5 days ago. So I'm only 5 days into that experiment, but
are you like shaking and going through the withdrawals?
I'm shockingly not. It's just like, when it's just not there with like the little red bubble. I mean, this is all the stuff we teach is like habit formation, right? So I kind of know the psychology behind it. But yeah, when it's not there giving you that little thing of dopamine sucking you in, right? Like, I think you'd be surprised about how little you think about it. So,
yeah, totally. Very cool. What book has impacted you deeply in the last few years?
Oh, in the last 2 years?
Yeah, just the last couple of years.
I think this is probably one you're going to hear from everybody, but I really enjoyed Principles from Ray Dalio. Even though I don't believe like 100%, not believe, but I don't subscribe to 100% of this stuff. Just like the very systematic, raw, honest approach is something that generally, has just become more of my style over the years of me working. So
I feel like you leave that book and I'm like, okay, I got to create this like algorithm that I can run every decision in my life through, and it's going to spit out like yes or no. And then you kind of pull it back. You say, okay, maybe if I just start building a few rocks into my life, I can kind of run decisions based off of that.
I would add to this, it's not a book, but I think it's just as high quality, if not more high quality, is most of the stuff by Tim Urban at Wait But Why. He has a number of articles on like, figuring out what you want to do as a profession, like really big life questions, like, should I get married to this person? And just observing how he researches and writes things, I think it is like an impactful thing in itself.
Yeah. No, very cool. Those were like some of the first blog posts I really started loving, and would just lay in bed like, it takes 45 minutes to read one of them. And those were awesome. Okay, number 5, what's the best purchase you've made in the last year or so for under $150?
Oh, under 100. I was going to say like I just got the new Apple Watch and I tried the first gen and was pretty disappointed, but the new Apple Watch is pretty, like, I'm in all these workout competitions with a few friends, and I would say that it's actually gotten me to work out more, but that was definitely more than $150. Under $150. I told you I'm kind of a coffee snob, but it's this kettle for pour overs, and I'm totally blanking on the brand right now, but it's a very distinct sort of all black matte kettle. Heats incredibly fast, and I don't know, it's just sort of something simple that I drink coffee every morning, but I don't know. It's just good. I think it's like maybe like $80 or something like that. So if you drink coffee, I have it.
Send me the link afterwards. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes, a link to that.
Yeah, that was a solid one for sure.
Okay, very cool. And then number 6, what do you think has been the primary reason that you've been successful up to this point in your life? What's driven that?
I mean, it's kind of a loaded question in the sense that it assumes that I think I'm successful. And I think, I'm sure some people would say that, but I guess the way that I think about it is that there's just like a pretty big delta between where I am today and some of the things that I would, love to achieve. So the way that I would rephrase that question is kind of what has been the most beneficial in my path so far. And by far it's been just really like investing in writing and to be honest, like just like my blog as part of that. So I can tie. I started my blog mostly because writing really helps me think and get clarity around a lot of things. I can't remember who wrote this post recently, but it's basically titled like "Writing is Thinking," and that's what I've just like learned. That's what I've just learned over time, and then just like publishing, like 5% of what I actually do write has led to pretty much every single company I started and job I've had, including HubSpot, and some of the most significant professional connections in my life. And I think that's just because it's one thing I think we should all move towards as professionals is act more like designers, meaning building a portfolio of showing off our work. It's just harder for people who work in like product and marketing because a lot of our work is just like thinking or analysis. And so we need to find ways to display that work. I think it just yields just an amazing amount of dividends. So that's what's been most impactful for me.
Very cool. Love it. Well, Brian, this has been awesome, man. So helpful. I'm thinking of a lot of things, that I want to apply at Proof here. That's what you said. And again, I've appreciated a lot of your work, even before this interview. I think it's been really impactful for how we've kind of launched products and tried to grow Proof. So if people want to find out more about you, follow you, read your blog posts, where can they find you?
My personal blog is just brianbalfour.com. Just search my name. It'll come up. Feel free to subscribe. I send very few emails, but try to make them impactful. I do. And then check out any of the programs at Reforge. Applications will open up early in the new year. We have the growth series, the retention engagement deep dive, and kind of an advanced growth strategy, one that goes really deep on this concept of loops and like quantitatively modeling them out. And we'll have more coming out in 2019. So would love to have any listeners part of that.
Sweet. Very cool, man. All right. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you're on YouTube or Facebook watching this. And thanks for joining us for Scale and Die. We'll see you in the next one.